Greetings. I'm Dorothy Mulder Roark, and my birthday is December 19, 1924, and this is 90 over 90.
A song to you, fair state of mind, Michigan, my Michigan, what greater song than this is thine? Michigan, my Michigan, the whisper of the forest tree, the thunder of the inland sea, unite in one grand symphony of Michigan, my Michigan.
I was born in Holland, Michigan, and I'm of Dutch descent. Both my grandparents, Mulder and Brummel, my mother's father, they migrated from the Netherlands when they were 13 years old. They each were 13, and they came to Holland, Michigan, and of course, that's the two generations ago that I'm a part of. So anyway, my late parents were Peter Mulder, and my late mother was Patty Brummel Mulder, and they had a family of 7 children. I had 5 brothers and 1 sister. My brothers were Earl, Harold, Bob, Ray, and Art, and my sister was Catherine, and of course I was the other sister, Dorothy, me. And so we lived on a 40-acre farm, and at the time, the Great Depression came along in 29 and 30, and people were hard hit, especially in the cities where they were laid off from work and didn't have gardens and animals like we did for food. On the farm, we had a big vegetable garden, we had a big orchard, we had a peach orchard on the sand hill on our farm, and so my mother canned everything. So all winter we enjoyed the products from our garden and orchard, and so we were well off. But the people inside the town, we were just outside the city, about 2 miles. So I went to a rural 2-room school. It was called the small room and the large room, and the grades, first grade through 4th were in the small, and grades 5 through 8. So I finished there, and then I went on to public high school in Holland, the city of Holland, and that was unusual. I was the first one in my family to go to high school, and so I enjoyed the public school for 8 years, and I graduated there in 1942, I guess it was. The town of Holland, where I lived, of course, was almost totally Dutch. Very few other nationalities at that time, like we have now. But anyway, the main thing Holland had that was of interest to the whole country was our Tulip Festival. And every year, the Tulip Festival was held the 3rd week of May. Now it's held earlier. But anyway, I was a Dutch dancer in the festival, and I danced during my junior and senior years in high school. And of course, we got to take off from school and go dance during the day with all the public lined along the streets watching us. And so that was great fun. But we started practicing in the high school gym right after Christmas. You could imagine 4 or 5 months on a wooden floor. So our feet were quite misshaped. But anyway, Holland was full of churches, Dutch Reformed churches, Christian Reformed churches, and church was very important. And the other thing about Holland was that the farms were all around it. All of my relatives lived on farms, and of course, as I mentioned, that was a plus when the Great Depression came along, that we had all this food, gardening, orchard, animals, beef cattle, pork, chickens, eggs, and we had, my mother bartered eggs for other groceries like sugar and flour, things that we didn't raise ourselves. Growing up in a Dutch family was something unusual to other people, other nationalities. The Dutch were very frugal with their finances and possessions. And the other thing was we couldn't go to movies, we couldn't wear makeup, and we just had to have everything cleaned up on Saturday. The yard had to be raked, all the food had to be cooked for Sunday, so we didn't work on the Sabbath day. And my mother stayed home while my dad took us to church and Sunday school. And of course, on Saturdays, we had to walk to catechism. That was a Bible study. And we were 3 miles from the church. So we walked 3 miles there and 3 miles back. And that was an ordeal because my dad gave us a nickel to put in the collection and a penny to stop at the country store halfway home and get the most candy we could get for 1 penny. And that happened to be a long licorice, kind of twisted black licorice string of candy, and that lasted all the way home. But anyway, it was, everybody was Dutch, so we were all living the same kind of life, so it didn't seem too different for us. Well, when I went to Holland High School, public school, that was quite different from the Rusker school, the one-room school that I went to. So I became acquainted with a lot of different types of people, which I enjoyed meeting and having social life with them. And I enjoyed the instructors. I remember several of my instructors, and they were. I enjoyed all of the subjects. In particular, I enjoyed communications, and I enjoyed English, and so those were some of my favorite subjects. But high school was quite different, of course. Now we were about 2 to 3 miles, and while I mentioned earlier when I was a Dutch dancer right after Christmas, I used to have to walk home because I missed my ride, and that was almost 3 miles every day. I had to walk home. And of course, back then, it wasn't as scary to have people stop and pick you up because we knew a lot of the people. And sometimes we would get a ride, but we'd have to be careful about that. But high school was one of my favorite chapters in my life. Well, after I finished high school, I had to make a decision about whether I was going to college. No one in my family had gone to college before. I had been in 4-H club work and had been to East Lansing and saw the Michigan State campus, and I fell in love with it. I thought, this is where I want to come. So being a free spirit, I told my dad I wanted to go to Michigan State. He said, well, I want you to go to Hope College, our church college right here in Holland. I said, no, I don't want to go there. I want to go to Michigan State. He said, well, I'm not going to pay for it. So I stayed out a year after high school, and I worked 2 jobs. One was a job as a secretary in a transfer company. That was in the morning between 8 and 12. Then I'd come home, and I'd get in my work clothes, and I'd go to a war plant. And I was Rosie the Riveter, and worked there off shift and come home after midnight. And then my hair would be full of oil from that machine, and I'd have to take care of that. My mother was really ahead of her time. She put out a big dish pan full of oatmeal, and I'd put my head in that and take all the oil out. And then I'd have to put my head up in curlers so I'd look good the next day in the office. So I did that for 1 year. And as a result, I made quite a bit of money, so I adequate finance to buy a good wardrobe, a nice wardrobe, and to pay my tuition, which was just $40 at that time. And then when I went to live at Michigan State, I went on and I lived in a co-op house, and that was $7.50 a week for meals and room and board. And that was, of course, wages were just slightly over $1,000 a year back then, so that wasn't too much different. But anyway, in college, I majored in communications. But when I went to make arrangements to come to the college, they said, well, you were a home ec major, but we don't want you to continue. You need to go into communications, and we'll give you an assistantship with our new educational television station, UNC-TV, which is just starting up. So I was assistant to the woman who was the head of the women's program, and I helped her with her program, and I helped produce other programs. And then, and so in college, I got a lot of experience, and I enjoyed all of the subjects and all the instructors at college level. But there were four main important areas in my life, and that was the church, community, education, and military when I was during the Korean War. Church was the most important. I've been a member of Shelby Presbyterian Church for 69 years now, and I've been active as an elder, a Sunday school teacher, on many, many committees. I was the church's Girl Scout leader, and I served on the presbytery in the Christian Education Committee. So I had a lot of church affiliations, which I enjoyed. And as I mentioned, it was the most important in my life. In the community area of my life, I was a volunteer in some areas, but I helped start 3 organizations. I helped get hospice started, I helped get the Abuse Prevention Council started, and I helped get Friends of the Library started, and then I served as a director on each of their committees, and I served on some state offices affiliated with those committees. So I had good experience there with these new organizations and enjoyed that so much. And of course I did lots of other volunteer work, collecting funds and so on. And finally my husband, Les Roark, said, well, you're working full-time, all this volunteer work, you might as well go back to work. So I did. I went back to work and worked with community college for 18 years. I was an administrative officer, and I handled the grants, the writing of the grants, and the solicitation for funds. Back then, when I started with the community college, we were in the old people's home, an old wooden building that served as assisted living. It was called the people's home. And when they come there, they had to work. They had cattle and they had gardens and so on, if they were able to work. And so after 2 years, they started building a permanent campus with new buildings, brick buildings. So I moved into that before I left. And so that was community, and I did many different types of work, community work. And then there's the next was education. And of course I had my bachelor's degree. I had a master's in educational television. I had an education specialist degree from Appalachian, and I did advanced studies at Virginia Tech. I took 10 years off, actually, to raise a family. I had 2 children. Pamela was born in 1957, and Jeff was born in 1960. And so I was there to help raise them during their early years, and I did a lot of volunteer work during that time. And so that was my education. After I retired from the community college, I worked 5 more years as a part-time worker with IBM out of Ottawa, Canada. And that was a special treat. And of course, then the military, that was the last of my 4 major interests. And I served in the Women's Air Force. Life magazine had come out with a big ad that they needed women officers during the Korean War for the enlisted to have. So I put in an application for that, and I was granted immediately a second lieutenant officer's job. And so I served 2 years on active duty, 1 year at Texas and Washington, and then I went to the far west and I served a year on Okinawa, and that was special because I fell in love with the Oriental culture, and I traveled on weekends when the men had to take their B-29 planes that they were bombing with. They took them up for extra certification hours, and we could jump aboard, go to China, go to Bangkok, around the far west. So while I was in the far west, I was in charge of top secret documents for the 20th Air Force there at Kadena Air Force Base at Okinawa. And my car went with me, so I had my car over there, and of course none of the streets were paved or blacktop. It was all cobblestone, so it chewed up the tires quite fast. Before I left, I sold my car to a taxi driver, and he was so glad to get it. But that was fun having my car there, because we could go up to the officers' rest center, fish, and have a weekend off now and then. So that was real special. And then when I came home after the war was over in '53, and I then took advantage of the GI Bill and got my master's under the GI Bill, which was $110 a month. And so I stayed in the reserve. I made first lieutenant before I left Okinawa, but then when I stayed in reserve for 4 or 5 years, then I made captain before I left the reserves. So I had an interesting military experience. While I was on Okinawa, I did get to travel to Japan frequently, and one of the weekend travels, there was a tea for Eleanor Roosevelt at the Palace Grounds. Normally the Palace Grounds wouldn't be open, but they were open that day, and so I and another RAF officer, we went through the receiving line. We told her that we were officers in the Women's Air Force, and she was so interested. She's quite tall. We had to look up at her, and but she was so hospitable and so kind, and she wanted to know all about our service. And so we had pictures made with her, and the next day in the Japanese newspaper, our picture came out with Eleanor Roosevelt. So that was real special, and she's one of my favorite mentors in my life, even to this day. When I came to Raleigh after my master's degree, I was one of the few women in the country that had an advanced degree in educational television. And I really had the choice of about 3 or 4 states, but I chose to come for an interview. And I remember Kay Kaiser, the band director, was on the interview committee, the president of the college. And so I got the job as a woman on their staff. And I had my own show called Today's Woman. I produced it and had the show, which was of interest to women, with various topics of art, food, nutrition, family relationships. And then I produced a couple other shows. But my time in Raleigh was really enjoyable. I got to meet a lot of other professional people in the media, both the newspaper, television, and radio. And so I enjoyed my social life with them, along with the educational television experience at UNC-TV. And several years later, I had to go to a meeting at the Research Triangle. I was serving on a committee called 40 for the Future, and we met with mostly presidents of colleges to plan what was going to be important for the community colleges in the future. And while I was there, the WNC station had just started a new office and a new studio in the same building where I was in the Research Triangle. So I went in and I saw the camera that I used to perform before, and I went over and patted it, and the young man on duty said, "Ma'am, could I help you?" I said, "Well, I was just patting the camera that I used to perform before against when they went on the air in '54. And he got so excited. He said, "You were here when we went on the air?" I said, "Yes, I helped with the production of a lot of shows." He ran up and down the hallway, and he called the people out. He said, "There's a lady here that's was here when we started in '54, and they got so excited, they all came running out. I guess they expected to see an old crumpled down person, and they were surprised. And so I told them about the fact that it was just black, white television back then, and that was the first machine that I had seen when I first came with him. But anyway, that was a lot of fun, finding out that they found it hard to remember about the beginning of the station. Well, one of the funny things funny jokes, I call it, that happened after I married my husband Les, who evidently was so involved in politics, more so than I was, but he was involved in politics on local, state, and national level. Anyway, so we got, when he was mayor, we got invited to a lot of events at Gardner-Webb, and they were having a brunch with the owner of Amway, was coming to be the speaker, and he was Dutch. In fact, he was in Holland Christian High School when I was in the public school, and those kids always thought they were better than we were. But anyway, when we went through the receiving line, I greeted him in Dutch. I said, "Who is er mee?" And he threw up his hands and he said, "My God, is there a Dutchman and another Dutchman at Gardner-Webb?" Well, actually, I guess I need to sum it up that I really was all for women, and I supported the ERA, the equal representation I had, and all the work I did, that I was working for the welfare of women at that time.